The direwolf did not growl. That was the first thing Sable noticed, and it was the thing that made no sense at all, the detail that lodged itself in her mind like a splinter she could not reach no matter how she tried. Every warrior in the Great Hall had gone still. Every advisor, every council member, every guard who had survived the Battle of the Ashvale Crossing had pressed himself against the stone walls as the creature entered through the shattered doors, its paws leaving blood prints on. The pale marble, its silver fur matted and dark, with what might have been the king's blood, or its own, or the blood of the enemies it had torn through to bring its master home. The direwolf was enormous, larger than any natural animal had a right to be, its shoulder blades reaching the chest of a grown man, its eyes the pale amber of winter sunlight filtered through ice. And it was not growling. It was not snarling. It walked through the hall of Vordenmar Keep with the terrible, deliberate calm of something that had already made a decision and was simply in the process of carrying it out. Lord Brennan stepped forward first, because Lord Brennan always stepped forward first. He was the king's brother, the second of the blood, and he had survived 30 years of court politics by being exactly the kind of man who moved toward dangerous things before anyone else could claim the credit. He held out his hand and spoke the direwolf's name in the old tongue, the word that bound the creature to the bloodline, the word that should have worked. The direwolf looked at him. Sable, standing at the very back of the gathered crowd with her healer's satchel clutched against her chest, watched the wolf look at Lord Brennan with those pale amber eyes, and she watched the wolf decide he was not what it was looking for. It walked past him. Just like that. As if he were a piece of furniture, as if 30 years of the king's brother being the most important man in any room he entered meant absolutely nothing to a creature whose loyalty was written in the blood and bone of another world entirely. The whispers started immediately, because they always did in courts, because the people who surrounded power could not survive a single moment of silence without filling it with interpretation. Sable heard the words, but did not process them, because she had begun to notice something that made her grip on her satchel tighten until her knuckles went pale. The direwolf was moving through the crowd in a specific direction. It was not wandering. It was not confused. It was navigating, gently but inexorably, around the bodies of frightened courtiers and battle-grim warriors, and the direction it was moving was toward the back of the hall. Toward her. "Do not move," someone hissed beside her, and she did not know who had said it, did not care, could not have moved if she wanted to, because her feet had become part of the stone floor, and the air in her lungs had turned to something thicker than air. The direwolf stopped in front of her. Just stopped, as if it had arrived at a destination it had been traveling toward for longer than this single night. It was so close she could feel the heat radiating from its body, could smell the blood and forest, and something wild underneath, could see the individual silver hairs of its coat catching the torchlight. It looked at her with those amber eyes, and then, with the slow deliberateness of a decision being made in full view of everyone present, it lowered itself to the ground at her feet and lay its great head on its paws. The silence in the hall was not silence at all. It was the held breath of 60 people trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Sable looked down at the direwolf, and then up at the faces around her, and what she saw in those faces was not wonder. It was calculation. The fast, cold arithmetic of people who understood power and were already working out what this moment meant for the positions they held and the futures they had planned. Lady Vivian, standing near the center of the room in a gown the color of deep water, was the only one not looking at the direwolf. She was looking at Sable, and her expression was the careful, composed expression of a woman who had just identified a problem. Sable was not supposed to be there. She wanted to say that to someone, to all of them, to press it into the record before the story could take shape without her. She had been called to the hall because the king had been brought home injured, and someone had thought to send for her at the last moment. An afterthought, a practical measure, the way one sent for a bucket when there was a fire. She was a healer. She healed things. She was not a warrior, not noble, not the descendant of anyone significant, not the holder of any title or land or magical lineage. She had grown up in the outskirts of Vordenmar territory, the daughter of a woman who had known a great deal about plants, and a great deal less about how to navigate a world that rewarded different kinds of knowledge. She had never shifted, never felt a wolf stir beneath her skin, never been claimed by any of the things that made a person matter in the hierarchy of the clans. She was invisible. She had spent years perfecting the craft of her own invisibility, and she had been very, very good at it, right up until the moment the king's direwolf had walked through an entire hall full of people who mattered and chosen to lie down at her feet instead. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The king was carried in on a stretcher borne by 4 of his elite guard, and even unconscious and bleeding, Calum of Vordenmar was the most physically commanding person Sable had ever seen. She thought that, and immediately felt ashamed of herself for thinking it, because he was dying and she was noticing his jawline, which was the kind of thing that happened when a person had been invisible for so long that their emotions had been starved into doing strange, desperate things. She had seen him before, from a distance, the way all the lower-ranked members of the keep had seen him, the tall silhouette on the walls, the controlled power of his movement in the training yard visible from the lane where she collected her medicinal herbs each morning. She had never been this close. She had never been close enough to see the lines of exhaustion carved into his face beneath the blood, or the way his hands, even unconscious, had curled slightly as if still holding the weapon he could no longer grip. "You," said Lord Brennan, and his voice was not kind, but it was controlled, which was the closest thing to kindness he seemed capable of. He was looking at her the way everyone was looking at her now, which was the way people looked at things they could not categorize and therefore could not trust. "You are the healer, Marin's daughter." "Yes, my lord," she said, because yes was the only safe answer, and she was an expert in safe answers. "Then heal him," Brennan said, and there was something in his voice beneath the command, something she recognized after years of reading the emotional frequencies underneath the words people chose, something that sounded like fear. Not fear of her, fear for his brother. Whatever Lord Brennan was as a politician, and as a man who navigated power like a shark navigated deep water, he loved his brother. Sable filed that away. She worked through the night. She did not notice the people watching her at first, because she rarely noticed things outside the immediate scope of what needed to be done, which was the quality that made her an excellent healer and a social catastrophe. The king had taken a blade to the side, deep but not clean, the kind of wound that would fester if not treated properly, and he had lost blood in quantities that should have killed most people and had not. Killed him because alpha wolves did not die the same way ordinary people did, their bodies fighting death with the same ferocity their wolves fought everything else. She cleaned and packed and sutured and prepared the fever-breaking tinctures and the poultices that would draw infection, and throughout all of it the direwolf lay at the edge of the chamber and watched her with those amber eyes, and she tried not to think about what that meant, because she could not afford to think about what that meant. Lady Vivian came to her at dawn. Sable had known she would. She had felt the woman's attention like a second shadow all through the night, the particular quality of being observed by someone who was deciding what to do with what they were seeing. Vivian was beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things were beautiful, which was to say that the beauty was part of the danger, a surface so perfect it invited you to stop looking for what was underneath. She was older than Sable by perhaps a decade, and she wore her experience the way she wore her gowns, as armor and display simultaneously. She had been positioned as the king's future consort for 2 years. The alliance her family represented was significant. Everyone in the keep had understood, if not formally announced, that when Kylum finally chose a mate, Vivian was the logical, the political, the correct choice. "You did well tonight," Vivian said, and the compliment landed in the room like the first move in a game of strategy, something that looked generous but was not. The king's life was not certain when they brought him in. It is more certain now, because of you. "I did my work," Sable said carefully. "Yes." Vivian looked at the direwolf, still lying in its place at the edge of the chamber. The wolf is unusual. I could not say, my lady. I have no expertise with direwolves. No one does, Vivian said pleasantly. They bond to the bloodline. They recognize the alpha's line and they protect it. They are not supposed to transfer their attention to strangers, regardless of circumstances. She paused. It is interesting. Is it not interesting, Sable? The use of her name without title or honorific was not casual. It was a measurement. Vivian was taking the measure of her, deciding how much threat she represented, deciding what kind of response was appropriate. Sable had grown up navigating situations like this one, had grown up watching the women in the keep's lower ranks be tested, and judged and arranged into hierarchies by people with more power. And she had survived every such encounter by making herself smaller, by deflecting, by becoming exactly as unremarkable as possible. It is unusual, my lady, she said. I am sure there is an explanation for it. I am sure there is, Vivian agreed, and smiled, and left, and the smile stayed in the room after her, like the scent of something that could hurt you if you breathed it in too deeply. Sable sat with the king for 3 days while he fought his fever. She told herself she sat with him because it was her professional responsibility, because fever was unpredictable and required monitoring, because the tinctures needed to be administered at specific intervals, and she was the only one who knew the proper quantities. These things were all true. She also sat with him because the direwolf would not leave unless she was present, and when the direwolf stayed, the room felt somehow safer, and she had not felt safe in a long time, possibly ever, and she was embarrassed by how much that mattered to her. On the second night, she spoke to the wolf. She had always spoken to animals, had done it since childhood, had found it easier than speaking to most people, because animals did not have agendas and did not require her to be smaller than she was. She asked the wolf's name. She knew the name in the old tongue, the formal binding name. But she asked anyway, the way you asked a question you already knew the partial answer to when you suspected there was more answer behind it. The wolf looked at her. Its tail moved. Once, slowly, the way the tails of large, solemn animals moved when they were acknowledging something. She took that as an answer. She named him Veth, which meant true north in a language so old even most scholars had forgotten it. She did not know where the word came from. It arrived in her mouth as if it had always been waiting there. That is his name, said a voice behind her. Rough with disuse and the particular roughness of someone speaking through the remnants of extreme pain, and Sable's entire body went rigid from the base of her spine to the crown of her head. She turned very slowly. The king was awake. He was watching her with eyes that were the same color as his wolf's, pale amber, winter sunlight through ice, and his expression was complicated in a way she did not have time to read before the fear hit her that he was awake and she had been talking to his wolf like it was a pet and calling it by a name from a language she did not speak. I apologize, she said immediately, and stood, because sitting when a king was speaking to you was not done, even if the king was flat on his back and technically in no position to enforce protocol. I did not know you were conscious. I was monitoring your fever, and the wolf was. I did not mean to presume. Sit down, he said, and his voice was quiet, the quietness of someone who did not need volume to make themselves clear. You are the one who has been sitting with me. Yes, my king. For how long? 2 days and the better part of a third, my king. He was silent for a moment, looking at the ceiling. Then he said, Veth has not left. No, she said. He would not go even when Lord Brennan tried to take him out to feed. I had food brought to him here. You fed my direwolf, Calum said. And there was something in his voice she could not read, a tone that might have been wonder or might have been something else entirely. It seemed practical, she said. He turned his head to look at her, and the quality of his attention was significant in a way she felt physically, the way you felt a change in pressure before a storm. He was still pale from blood loss, still marked with the evidence of everything he had survived. But his eyes were clear and fully present, and the intelligence behind them was not diminished in the slightest. He looked at her the way the wolf had looked at her, with a recognition that made no logical sense and hit her somewhere beneath logic entirely. "What is your name?" he said. "Sable, my king. Marin's daughter, from the eastern quarter." "Marin's daughter," he repeated slowly, as if the name meant something to him. "I knew Marin." She had not expected that. She had not known her mother to have been known by anyone of significance. Marin had been remarkable to her, had been the whole architecture of her childhood. But her mother had been, by every external measure, as unremarkable as Sable herself. "You knew my mother," she said carefully. "A long time ago," he said. "She was extraordinary." He closed his eyes, and for a moment, she thought he had fallen back into sleep, and she felt the loss of his attention like a physical thing, which alarmed her considerably. Then he said, without opening his eyes, "Do not go anywhere. I will stay as long as I am needed, my king." "You will stay longer than that," he said, and something in his voice was the same certainty the wolf had shown when it walked past 60 people and lay down at her feet. And Sable sat very still in her chair and told herself that she was misinterpreting, that she was sleep-deprived and emotionally compromised by 3 days of isolation in a chamber with a dying man and his supernatural wolf, and that whatever she thought she had just heard in those words was the product of her own traitorous imagination. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. Calum recovered faster than any human would have, which was not surprising but was still startling to witness up close. By the 4th day he was sitting up. By the 5th he was standing, slowly and with visible cost, but standing, his body rebuilding itself with the particular aggressive determination of alpha shifter biology. Sable had tried to maintain the appropriate professional distance during this process, and had succeeded approximately none of the time, because the appropriate professional distance was difficult to maintain when the patient in question kept asking her questions. Not the questions a patient normally asked a healer, not the questions about tinctures and timelines, and when he might resume training. He asked her questions about herself, the way someone asked questions who was genuinely curious, which was a sensation Sable had not experienced often enough to handle with any grace. He asked about her work, and she told him about the plants she gathered and the properties she had spent years cataloging. And he listened with the focused attention of someone who was not waiting for his turn to speak. He asked about her childhood, and she told him the parts that were safe to tell. The mornings with her mother in the forest, the animals she had helped, the strange sensation she had always had of understanding creatures in a way that bypassed normal communication. He did not ask about the things she was not telling him, the years after her. Mother died, the systematic diminishment of being the daughter of nobody in a place that valued lineage above everything. She was grateful for that, and then suspicious of her own gratitude, because gratitude toward powerful people had historically been how less powerful people got themselves into trouble. The trouble arrived in other forms. The court had opinions about her presence in the king's chamber that it expressed through a variety of methods, none of them subtle. She found her herbs rearranged in ways designed to make her look disorganized. She found notes from council members, formally worded but unmistakably hostile, suggesting that the king's care be transferred to the pack's official physician, now that the immediate crisis had passed. She found herself excluded from the small daily briefings that gathered outside the king's chamber door, information exchanged within earshot of her previous position, but moved once she had begun occupying it, a reorganization that was too deliberate to be accidental. And Vivienne, gracious and composed and present at every occasion, watched all of it with the patient satisfaction of someone who had set a process in motion and was waiting for it to reach its natural conclusion. Sable knew she should leave. She knew it the way she knew most things she did not want to know, clearly and completely, with no room for self-deception. She should complete the king's treatment, hand over the remaining tincture instructions to whoever replaced her, make herself small and unremarkable again, and go back to the eastern quarter and the work that had always been hers, and the life that was modest but survivable. She should do this because staying was dangerous, because the attention the Direwolf had focused on her was not something she could control or explain, and it had made her visible in a way that visibility in places like this court had consequences, because Calum himself was a danger she did not have the vocabulary to name. Yet, the way he looked at her, the way he listened, the way Veth moved to her side whenever she entered the room as if the geometry of the space required it. She should leave. She did not leave. She told herself she stayed because he was not yet fully healed. She told herself she stayed because no one else in the keep knew the specific combination of fever suppressants his particular strain of wound infection required, and it would be irresponsible to abandon treatment midway through. These things were true, and they were not the reason. On the 7th morning, he found her in the herb garden before anyone else was awake. She had been coming here at dawn since she was a child, and the habit was too deep to break even when the circumstances of her life had changed into something she no longer recognized. She was kneeling in the soft earth beside the elder root she had been tending for 2 years, her hands already dirty, her hair loose, because she had not yet dressed for the day, and she heard his footstep and knew it was him before she turned. She had learned the sound of him in 7 days, the way she had always learned animals, through some awareness she could not explain, and had long since stopped trying to. "You should not be walking this far," she said, standing and not bothering to wipe the dirt from her hands. "You will reopen the sutured tissue if you strain it." "I heal faster than you account for," he said. He was dressed simply, no armor, no formal marks of rank. And in the gray early morning light, with his hair unbound and his expression open in a way it was never open when the court was watching, he looked like a different version of himself. A truer version, she thought, and then pushed that thought away. "I wanted to see what you did here. I maintain the medicinal garden," she said. "The keep's garden has been neglected since the previous healer retired. Half the useful stock had died back. I have been rebuilding it." He looked at the rose she had tended, the careful organization of it, the labels she had written in the small, precise script she used for all her cataloging. "You did this alone. It needed to be done. That is not an answer." "Yes," she said. "I did this alone. No one else was particularly interested." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden with the same focused attention he gave to everything. Veth appeared from somewhere. The wolf always knew where they both were, and arranged himself between them in a way that was not quite between them, more a physical manifestation of something that already existed in the air of the space. Sable looked at the wolf and felt the same sensation she had felt the first night, the sense of a truth being stated by a creature whose communication was too direct for the complexity that humans wrapped around true things. "Veth has bonded to the Alpha line for 4 generations, Calum said without preamble. "His father's line. There is one precedent in the oldest texts of a direwolf breaking its pattern of recognition, extending its bond beyond the blood." He paused. "The precedent occurs when the wolf identifies a true mate, not a convenient mate, not a political alliance, a true mate." The word landed in the morning air between them and did not dissolve. Sable stood very still, her dirty hands at her sides, her heart doing something that had nothing to do with the calm professionalism she was attempting to project. "I understand the concept," she said, carefully. "Do you?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "I understand that it is sacred," she said. "I understand that it is irrevocable. I understand that it supersedes other considerations under pack law." She paused. "I also understand that pack law and political reality are not always the same thing, my king." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen there before. Not in 7 days of tending him, not in all the conversations, not in the moments when his guard had been lowest. It was the expression of someone who had been seen, clearly and without flattery, and did not know what to do with that. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "I am afraid of many things," she said honestly. "You are not the most frightening one currently." What is? She considered the question and decided on truth, because she was tired, and because the morning was very early and the court had not yet put on its face, and because she had spent enough of her life not saying true things that one more untruth felt like a weight she could not lift. What is happening? She said. What your wolf did. What it means. Not because I do not want it, but because I do not understand it. And I have survived in this keep for a long time by understanding things. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Your mother came from the old blood, the first blood, before the clans divided. Sable went still in a way that was different from her previous stillness. This was the stillness of something shifting underneath her, a tectonic movement she had not known was possible. My mother was a healer, she said, from the Eastern Quarter. Your mother was a healer who chose to disappear, he said, who chose a quieter life than the one she was born to, who had reasons for that choice that I do not fully know. He turned to look at her, and his expression was careful now, careful in something else, something that might have been the very early beginning of an apology. I knew her briefly, years ago. She was remarkable in ways that I did not fully understand until recently. He looked at Veth. Until Veth made his choice. The sun had begun to properly rise, and the garden was filling with the particular golden light of early morning that made everything look like something that had been there forever, had always been true, had only been waiting for the right conditions to become visible. Sable thought about her mother, the way she had moved through the world with a quietness that had always felt chosen rather than imposed, the way she had known things about plants and animals, and the old patterns of the land that went beyond what she had explained as study, the way she had looked at Sable sometimes with an expression that contained something she was saving for a later conversation that had never arrived, because she had died before it could. You are telling me, Sable said slowly, that my mother chose to make herself less than she was. I am telling you, he said, that I believe she had her reasons, and that those reasons did not transfer to you the diminishment she intended. Veth knows what you are better than you do. Sable looked at the wolf. The wolf looked back, with those amber eyes that held the particular steady warmth of something that had no interest in anything except truth. She felt, for the first time in a long time, possibly for the first time ever, the strange and frightening sensation of being fully known and not found wanting. The knowing was interrupted, as most things in courts were interrupted, by politics. Lord Brennan came to her that afternoon with the courtesy of someone performing courtesy as a strategic act. He was not cruel about it. She appreciated that, and did not trust it. He explained, with the precision of a man who had arranged difficult conversations many times, that the king's recovery was progressing well, and that the council was grateful for her service, and that there would be compensation for her time, and that the keep's physician would resume primary care as of tomorrow morning. He said all of this looking at a point slightly above her head, which was the technique of people who had learned to deliver unwanted news without having to fully witness its reception. I see, she said. The king, Brennan said, and here he paused, and the pause was different from his other pauses, heavier, has obligations that predate his illness, commitments that the council has been patient about and cannot remain patient about indefinitely. You understand. I understand obligations, she said. Lady Vivian's family has extended considerable political support to the northern expansion, he said. The timing of this alliance matters. Wars are not won in the field alone. The king knows this. He has always known this. He finally looked at her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that surprised her, something almost like regret. He is a good man, Sable. He is also a king, and kings do not always have the luxury of their own desires. She wanted to tell him that she had not asked for any of this, that a wolf had walked through a hall and chosen her, and none of that had been her design or her desire or her fault, and that she was being managed out of a situation she had not sought. She said none of this because she was not certain it was entirely true. She had not sought it. She was not certain she did not want it. The distinction was becoming harder. to maintain. That evening, Calum sent for her. Not through a messenger, not through the formal channel of a summons delivered by a guard. He sent Veth, who appeared at the door of her small chamber in the healer's wing, and looked at her with the patient expectation of an animal who had never considered the possibility of being ignored. She followed the wolf through corridors emptied by the late hour, up into the section of the keep where the king's private rooms were, past guards who let her pass because Veth walked beside her, and the guards had apparently decided that the wolf's judgment was sufficient authorization. Calum was standing at the window when she arrived, looking out at the forest that edged the keep's walls in the darkness, and he did not turn immediately when she entered, which she thought might be because he was working out how to begin. She stood in the doorway and waited, which she was good at. She had been practicing patience her entire life. Brennan spoke to you, he said. It was not a question. Yes. He is not wrong, Calum said, and his voice was flat in the way voices went flat when they were suppressing something that could not be expressed without cost. About the alliance, about what is at stake politically, he is not wrong. I know, she said. He turned then, and his face was the face of someone fighting something, and she recognized that face because she had worn it herself many times, the face of someone who knew what they were supposed to do and was discovering that knowing was not the same as being able to do it. I have been responsible for this territory since I was 19 years old, he said. I have made every decision, including the decisions that cost me things, based on what was required of me. That is not self-pity. It is a statement of fact. I believe you, she said. Veth has never been wrong, he said. In 4 generations, the line of direwolves before him has never been wrong. The mate bond is sacred under every law, old and new, that governs what I am and where I come from. He stopped. I am also a king, and those 2 things are currently at war with each other in a way that I do not know how to resolve. She crossed the room, because she was tired, and because he deserved honesty, and because she had decided somewhere in the past 7 days that she would rather be honest about what she was than small about what she was supposed to be. She stopped close to him, not touching, just close, close. Enough that the wolf's warmth and the specific gravity of his presence were things she could feel. I am not asking you to choose me, she said. I want to say that clearly. I did not come to this keep to be chosen. I came to heal you, because I was sent for. And everything else that has happened since then has happened to me rather than because of me. I know that, he said. But I also, she said, and stopped, and made herself continue because the habit of silence was powerful, and she was tired of its power over her. I also know what I felt when you woke up. I know what I feel when I am in this room. I know what Veth knows. I think, underneath all the parts of myself I have trained not to know things. And I am not going to pretend otherwise just because pretending would be more convenient for everyone. She met his eyes. I am telling you this, not to put pressure on your choice. I am telling you because I am finished making myself smaller to make other people more comfortable. And I thought you should know that, whatever you decide. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he raised his hand and touched her face, very lightly, the kind of touch that was not claiming anything, only acknowledging, only saying I see you in the most basic physical language available to them. The warmth of it moved through her like something that had been waiting a long time for permission to arrive. Veth made a low sound from the corner of the room. The first sound she had heard the wolf make that was not a warning. A sound like deep satisfaction, like the resolution of a chord that had been held suspended through many long measures of music. I have to go to the council, he said. And his voice was different now, less flat, more complicated. The voice of someone who had made a decision and was living in the immediate aftermath of having made it. I have to manage the consequences of this. It will not be simple, and I will not pretend to you that it will be. Vivian's family will not accept a quiet resolution. Brennan will be angry in a way that will matter to him for years. There are political implications I have been calculating for the past 2 days, and have not finished calculating. He looked at her steadily. But I will not do what I was planning to do before this morning. I will not proceed with an arrangement my wolf has refused, and my own judgment has refused. Along with him, because I can be a pragmatic man, but I am not yet capable of being that particular kind of fool. She did not cry. She was not, as a general rule, someone who cried, and she was not going to start now in a king's private chamber in the middle of the night. But she felt something release in her chest, some long-held tension in the architecture of herself, and she breathed differently after it released, as if the room had acquired more air. "I should return to my wing," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow will be difficult. I want you to be rested for it." "You want me to be rested," she said, with the slight edge of someone who had just been informed that their difficult tomorrow had been planned for them. A corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest she had seen to a smile from him, and it changed his face entirely, made it younger, made it the face of someone who was not only a king, but a person inside a king, someone who had perhaps been waiting a long time for a person who would catch that small movement of his mouth and understand what it contained. "I want you to be rested," he confirmed. "I have found that battles are better fought from a foundation of adequate sleep." She left because she should, and she walked back through the corridors with Veth accompanying her as far as the turn toward the healer's wing, and she lay on her narrow bed in her narrow room and looked at the ceiling and understood, with the clarity that came only in the very late hours of significant days, that nothing about her life was going to be what it had been, and that this frightened her, and that the fear and the sensation of possibility were the same feeling wearing different names. The council meeting was at midday. She was not invited, which was expected, but the keep's internal communication channels, by which she meant the people who swept the corridors and the ones who carried water for the kitchens, were thorough and prompt. And by the time the afternoon, light had shifted from midday gold to the longer, softer angle of late afternoon, she had a reasonably complete picture of what had occurred. Calum had informed the council of his intention to invoke the mate, bond right of recognition under the old law. Brennan had argued against it for 20 minutes in the careful, forensic manner that he argued everything. 3 of the 6 council members had abstained rather than oppose the king outright. 2 had supported him, the older ones, who remembered the old laws better and had perhaps been waiting for a king who would enforce them. And Vivian had listened to all of it with the composed expression of someone who was already 3 moves ahead in a game that the rest of the room had only just recognized was being played. She came to Sable that evening, as Sable had known she would, because Vivian was too intelligent to waste time on denial, and too strategic to leave a conversation unhad. She came alone, without the attendants, who usually gave her entrances their particular quality of managed importance, and she sat across from Sable in the healer's workroom and looked at her with the clear, direct gaze of someone who had made a decision to see things accurately. "I want you to understand something," Vivian said. "I am not a fool. I have never been a fool, which is why I have survived as long as I have in the position I hold. I understood before Calum went to the council what was going to happen. I have understood it truthfully, since the night Veth walked through the hall." She looked at her hands, and then back at Sable. "I have spent 2 years positioning myself for something that was, it turns out, never available to me. That is not your fault. That is a circumstance, and I am old enough to know the difference between a circumstance and an enemy." Sable watched her carefully. "What are you telling me, my lady?" "I am telling you," Vivian said, "that I am not going to be your enemy. I am telling you that the instinct you may have to treat me as one is understandable, but would be a waste of resources that you will need for other things." She paused. "The court is not uniformly pleased with what happened today. There are people who see in the old law a threat to the political architecture they have built. There are people who believe that a king should choose his mate from appropriate stock, which is a way of saying that they do not believe you are appropriate. They will not say this directly. They will say it in the manner that courts always say things, obliquely and persistently, and in ways that accumulate over time into something that feels like the truth. She met Sable's eyes. You will need to be stronger than you have allowed yourself to be. Not harder. Stronger. There is a difference. I know there is a difference, Sable said. I thought you might, Vivian said, and stood. At the door she paused, which was a habit of hers, Sable had noticed. The pause at the door. That left room for the last significant thing. Your mother was from the Sorven line. I recognized the name when Brennan mentioned it. The Sorven line has been believed extinct for 30 years. Its gifts were considerable. She looked at Sable with something that was, surprisingly, almost respect. The wolf was not wrong. In case you needed to hear that from a source with no emotional stake in your believing it. She left, and the room felt different after her departure. Not lighter. Exactly. But recalibrated. The way rooms felt after the conclusion of a significant conversation that had gone differently than expected. Sable sat for a long time with the word Sorven, turning in her mind, testing it against everything she had known about her mother, and finding that it fit in the way that true things fit. Not by filling a gap, but by explaining why the gap had always been shaped the way it was. The Sorven line. She had heard of it in the old histories her mother had taught. Her, in the way her mother had taught her many things, as stories rather than facts, as ancient material rather than personal heritage. The Sorvani had been the oldest healing bloodline, older than the pack divisions, older than the current kingdom's structures. They had carried gifts that were different from the warrior gifts that the Alpha lines valued, gifts of perception and communion, of understanding between species, of sensing the true nature of things beneath their presented surfaces. The last Sorven had been a woman who chose to disappear rather than submit to a political alliance, a woman who chose the Eastern Quarter and a simple life, and a daughter she raised alone, teaching her things in the manner of stories, because the truth of them was too large and too dangerous to carry openly in a world that did not know what to do with it. Sable went to the window and looked out at the forest, and for the first time in her life, she let herself feel the thing she had been. Not feeling for as long as she could remember. The particular frequency of the world that had always been accessible to her, and that she had always refused to fully inhabit because it was too different, too strange, too much of an explanation for why she had never quite fit the shape that was expected of her. The forest breathed at her through the glass, and she breathed back at it. And somewhere in the keep behind her, she felt Veth lift his great head and look in her direction, aware of the shift in her the way he was always aware of everything that pertained to the bond he carried. She had a lineage. She had a blood that was not nothing. She had a mother who had loved her enough to keep her safe by keeping her small, and who had also, perhaps, kept her small in ways that her daughter would spend the rest of her life growing back into. These things were true simultaneously, and Sable let them be true simultaneously, which was the first genuinely adult thing she had done in a long time. The blood moon ceremony was scheduled for the following month. The great ceremony that occurred once each lunar year and served as the primary ritual occasion for significant pack announcements, bondings, and recognitions. It had been scheduled long before any of this had happened, long before a direwolf had walked through a hall and changed the particular architecture of what was possible. The council had argued, predictably, that the timing was too soon, that preparations for a mate. Recognition of the king required more ceremony than 1 month allowed. That precedent suggested a longer interval of formal courtship and review. Calum had listened to all of these arguments with the attention he gave everything, and had then made clear that the mate bond did not improve with delay, and that the law had no requirement for a review period, and that they would proceed at the blood moon. Sable spent the month learning what she was. This was not a process she had anticipated, and it was not comfortable, because nothing about expanding the actual dimensions of yourself into spaces you had been contracting away from for years was comfortable. But it was necessary in a way she felt in her bones, in the way that necessary things registered as obligations to yourself that you had been postponing past the point of responsible delay. She worked with an old woman named Geleth, who lived in the deep records room, and who had the particular quality of old women who had survived long. Enough to have no investment in other people's expectations of them. Geleth knew the Sorven histories. She knew them the way she knew all the old histories, completely and without sentiment. And she laid them out for Sable in her workroom, over a series of mornings that smelled of old paper and dried herbs, and the honest dust of things that had been waiting a long time to be found. The gifts of the Sorven line were not the gifts of warriors or kings. They did not make their holder stronger, in the ways that the pack hierarchies valued. They made their holder more permeable, more receptive, more capable of the kind of understanding that operated beneath the level of words. They were the gifts of healers in the deepest sense, not merely the healing of bodies, but of the fractures in the connections between things, the capacity to perceive what was broken in a system and understand what it required, the ability to communicate across the boundaries that normally separated species and individuals and kinds of knowing. They were, Geleth told her, with the satisfaction of someone delivering the punchline to a long story, the gifts of a queen. Not the kind of queen who ruled by rank and force, but the kind that a kingdom actually needed, the kind that could hold the things together that power alone could not hold. Your mother knew this, Sable said. Your mother knew this, Geleth agreed. And she made a choice that women in difficult positions often make, which was to hide what she carried so that it could not be used against her. The wisdom and the tragedy of that choice are both apparent. She should have told me, Sable said, and felt the anger and the grief of that as the same thing, which was how they usually arrived. She should have, Geleth said, without equivocation or comfort, which was the kind of honesty that was kinder than comfort in the long run. She did not. And now you know. The knowing had practical consequences. Sable had always had a facility with animals that she had attributed to patience and observation, the same way she had always understood the emotional states of people around her, with a speed and accuracy she had attributed to attentiveness. She understood now that both of these things were true, that she was patient and observant and attentive, and also that they were evidence of something operating at a level beneath deliberate skill. She could not shift, had never shifted, would perhaps never shift in the way the wolf-blooded members of the pack did, but she had something else, something Geleth called the resonance, which was the Sorven capacity to feel the living world around them as a continuous and navigable field of information. It was why Veth had recognized her. It was why she had recognized him. It was why Calum had woken from his fever and looked at her as if he already knew her face. She practiced, in the month before the blood moon, allowing herself to actually use what she had instead of suppressing it. This required considerable effort, because suppressing it had been her primary occupation for 23 years, and the habit was well established. But Veth helped, which was a strange and grounding thing, the wolf's patient presence in her daily life as she learned to trust the sense that had always been hers, and she found that as she stopped trying to be less than she was, the world became larger in ways that were frightening and beautiful in equal measure. She also, in the month before the blood moon, began to understand what she and Kylam were building between them, which was harder than understanding her lineage, and required a different kind of courage. He came to the herb garden most mornings when his duties allowed, which was not always, but was often enough to establish a pattern. She found herself orienting around in ways she monitored with some suspicion. He was not easy to know, in the way that people who had been carrying enormous weights alone for long. Periods were not easy to know, the weight having shaped the manner in which they held themselves, the habits of self-containment having calcified into something that looked like reserve, but was actually loneliness of a very specific and practiced kind. She knew this landscape. She had lived in it herself. She asked him questions, the way she asked everything questions, with the direct curiosity of someone who had long since given up the pretense that indifference was safe. She asked him about the battle, and he told her, not the version told to courts, but the actual thing, the fear and the decisions and the cost, speaking in the flat, precise voice of someone who was accustomed to giving accurate reports to himself, but not to other people. She asked him about the northern expansion and the political architecture that made it necessary, and he explained it to her with the slight surprise of someone not accustomed to having their explanations actually absorbed, and she absorbed them. Because she was interested, and because if this was going to be her world, she intended to understand it, rather than navigate it in the manner she had navigated the keep, carefully and partially and always, with one eye on the exit. She asked him once what he had been like before he was a king, and he went quiet in the way he went quiet when a question had gotten somewhere real. Then he said, "Younger, less careful," and after a pause, "I had a wolf that was louder in those days. The sovereignty dampens it over time, the requirements of the position. Veth was always more than the wolf inside me, always his own being. But even Veth has been quieter these past years." He looked at her. "Until the night he brought me home. The morning of the blood moon ceremony, Sable woke before dawn and lay in the dark and took an honest inventory of her fear. She was afraid of the public aspect of it, which was the largest fear, the focused attention of the entire pack and court gathered for the most significant ritual of the lunar year. She was afraid of being seen as an interloper, a person who had manipulated circumstances she had not created in order to access power she had not been born to, which was not what had happened but was the story that was available to people who wanted a story that made her the problem. She was afraid of the parts of herself she had only recently met, the lineage and the resonance and the sense of being larger than she had always been told she was. Because being larger meant that more could be asked of her and more could be lost. She was also, beneath all of these fears, the way water was beneath other things, profoundly certain. She had not been certain of many things in her life. Certainty had felt like a luxury she could not afford. But this morning, in the dark before the blood moon, she felt it clearly. The sense of alignment, the sense of having arrived at the shape her life had always been moving toward. And she was afraid and certain, simultaneously, which was perhaps the definition of being ready for something even when you did not feel ready. She dressed with care, which was unusual for her, care in dressing having always felt like an assertion of significance she did not think she had the right to make. Geleth had laid something out for her, not a court gown, not the elaborate constructed display of the noble women who would be present, but something in the colors of the Sorven line, deep green and silver and old gold. Simple in its construction and exact in what it said. Sable put it on and looked at herself in the small, polished metal mirror above her basin, and saw a person she had not seen before. The same face but carrying itself differently. The bones of it, the same bones, but held by someone who had decided, this morning, to actually inhabit them. Veth was waiting for her outside her door. He fell into step beside her, and they walked together toward the great ceremonial clearing where the blood moon gathering was held each year, and the guards they passed in the corridors stood aside with an expression she was not accustomed to receiving, which was recognition. Not of her name or her rank, but of what walked beside her and what that meant about who she was. The clearing was full. The entire pack, the warriors and the council and the court and the people of the territory who traveled to attend the ceremony each year, the children and the elders and everyone in between, gathered under the weight of the full moon's particular red-tinged light, which turned the silver of Veth's coat to something that looked almost like fire. Sable moved through the crowd, and the crowd parted for her, not dramatically, not with the performance of recognition, but with the steady natural movement of water around something that has been placed in its center. She was aware of eyes following her. She was aware of Vivienne watching from near the ceremonial platform, and the expression on Vivienne's face was not hostility, but something more complex, something that might have been the satisfaction of someone watching a thing happen that they had predicted would happen. She was aware of Brennan, who looked at her with the expression of a man who had accepted something he had not wanted to accept, and was in the process of deciding what his relationship with that acceptance was going to be. She was aware, most of all, of Calum, who was standing at the center of the ceremonial platform in the formal marks of his kingship, and who looked at her across the entire assembled gathering with the particular directness of someone who had stopped managing the expression on his face and was simply letting it show what it contained. The ceremony of the blood moon followed its ancient forms, the blessing of the lunar cycle, the acknowledging of the pack's losses and gains in the year past, the small rituals that connected the present to the long chain of the same rituals extending back to the beginning of the pack's history. Sable stood at the edge of the platform space and listened and watched and felt the resonance of all these assembled lives around her, the particular frequency of community, the sense of belonging to something larger than the individual, which was a sensation she had been adjacent to for her entire life, without ever having been genuinely inside it. Then, Calum spoke the words that invoked the mate bond rite, the old words in the old tongue that she now knew the meaning of, because Geleth had taught her, words that said, "This is the one the wolf chose. This is the one who carries what I carry, and understands what I understand, and completes what I could not complete alone." The words went through the clearing like something physical, like a stone dropped in still water, the ripple of them moving outward through the gathered pack. And Sable felt every person in that clearing recalibrate in the moment after the words landed, felt the shift in the field of the resonance, the collective intake of recognition. She walked to the center of the platform because her feet knew the way, which was perhaps the most important thing that had happened in all the months of learning what she was, that her feet had stopped requiring her mind's permission to go where they needed to go. She stood in front of Calum and looked at him, and he looked at her, and Veth arranged himself between them, and then shifted, moving so that he was behind her instead of between, which was a statement so clear that even the members of the gathered pack who did not know every nuance of the Direwolf's symbolic language understood it. Not beside, not between, but behind. Supporting. Witnessing. "The Direwolf has chosen," Calum said, and his voice was the formal voice of ceremony, the carrying voice, the one trained to reach the edges of large gatherings, and she could hear underneath it the other voice, the one from the herb garden in the morning, the one that asked her questions and listened when she answered. "And I have chosen. Under the law of the old bond, under the compact of the blood moon, before the pack and the wolf and the turning of the year." He held out his hand to her, not the formal gesture of the ceremony, not the claiming gesture that she had read about in Geleth's histories, but the simple gesture of a person extending a hand to another person across a space that both of them had spent too long alone inside. She looked at it, and at him, and at the red moonlight, and at Veth's amber eyes watching from behind her, with the patient certainty of something that had known this was coming long before either of the humans involved had caught up. She took his hand. The sound that moved through the gathered pack was not applause, not the performative response of an audience. It was something older than that, the involuntary sound of many people in the same moment recognizing something true, the collective exhale of a held breath releasing, the resonant hum that communities produced when something that had been out of alignment moved back into its proper place. Sable felt it move through her, felt it move through the resonance that was now fully hers to inhabit, felt Calum's hand warm around hers, felt Veth's presence behind her like the deep root system of something that was not going to move. She had spent her life making herself smaller than she was. She had done it expertly, and she had done it because she thought it was necessary, and she had done it because the world she lived in had made clear in many ways that her full size was inconvenient. Standing on the blood moon platform with the red light overhead, and the pack breathing around her, and the king's hand in hers, and his wolf at her back, she understood finally what her mother had perhaps always known would happen if the right circumstances arrived, the right moment, the right witness. You could make yourself small for a long time. You could do it. Skillfully and for reasons that were even, in their way, loving. But what you were did not diminish because you refused to look at it. It waited, the way the elder root waited each winter, knowing what it was, knowing spring would return. She was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had simply been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for the moment when she could afford to be seen. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments. Did you see this ending coming? Calum did not release her hand when the ceremony concluded. This was noted by everyone present, because kings released hands after formal ceremonies, because there was always the next obligation and the shift back into the managed performance of sovereignty, because a public sentiment had its proper duration, and transgressing it drew attention. He did not release her hand, and the attention it drew was of the kind that can only be drawn when a powerful person does something that reveals, without ambiguity, what they have decided matters more than management. The court read it the way it read everything, quickly, and with the application of every layer of interpretation available to it. Some of what they concluded was correct. Brennan was the first to offer his formal acknowledgement, which was significant, because Brennan's acknowledgement carried the weight of the royal blood's endorsement, and the court would follow where he led. He came to them on the platform when the main ceremony had ended, and the gathering had shifted into the less formal movement of people talking, and the communal fire being lit, and the blood moon's particular atmosphere of license and loosening. He looked at Sable with the expression of someone who was still calculating, and had arrived at a conclusion he had not expected to arrive at. "You will need support with the council," he said to her directly, without preamble. "Some members will challenge the legitimacy of the Sorven claim. The records are old and disputable. You should know this." "I know this," she said. "Do you also know," he said, "that you will have more of the council than you currently expect? There are members who remember the old alliances and who have been waiting for a Sorven-adjacent claim for years, not because of politics, but because the pack has been missing something for a generation, and some of us have known what it was." He glanced at Calum, and the glance contained a long and complicated brotherly history in its several seconds of duration. He will need a partner who understands both the old ways and the practical present. That is an unusual combination. He looked back at her. "From what I have observed in the past month, you may have it." He bowed, formally, in the manner of an equal acknowledging an equal, which was the most significant gesture she had received from any member of the court, and moved away into the gathering, and she felt Calum's hand tighten briefly around hers. "He did not do that easily," Calum said quietly. "I know," she said. "It means more because of that." The fire was lit, and the moon was at its height, and the pack celebrated around them, the way packs celebrated, with the particular fullness of people who lived with their emotions closer to the surface than ordinary people did, who laughed louder and grieved harder, and loved with the whole-body commitment of creatures whose wolves would not permit them the luxury of partial feeling. Sable stood in the middle of all of it, and let herself be in the middle of all of it, not at the edges, not positioned for a quick exit, not performing the unremarkability she had spent years mastering. She was present. She was seen. She was, for the first time, in the exact place the shape of her life had always been leading her. And if that was frightening, it was the kind of fear that was indistinguishable from the feeling of being finally, completely awake. Later, when the fire had burned lower and the gathering had thinned, and the moon had moved through its arc and begun its descent, Calum took her to the eastern wall of the keep where the forest was closest, and the old stone was warm with the day's stored heat. They stood together without the ceremony, and the gathered eyes, and the weight of what had been decided, and they were simply two people who had found each other through the particular grace of a wolf, who knew the truth before either of them did. "You were afraid this morning," he said. It was not a question. He had learned to read her with the same directness she read everything else, and she had decided some weeks ago that she was not going to find this unsettling anymore. "I was afraid," she agreed. "I was also certain. I find that they often arrive together when it matters." "Yes," he said. "I have found the same." He looked at the forest, and she felt in him the thing she had felt in the clearing, the sense of alignment, of something that had been held in tension for a long time releasing. "When I was injured at Ashvale," he said, "the last thing I was aware of before I lost consciousness was Veth, the direction he ran. I could not understand it at the time. I was not in a condition to understand anything. A pause. I understood it when I woke. What did it feel like? She asked. When you woke. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to questions that deserved seriousness. Like arriving somewhere. He said finally. Like the completion of a journey I had not known I was on. She thought about her mother, in the forest, in the early mornings, teaching her the names of things. She thought about 23 years of being careful and small, and positioned for exit. She thought about Geleth's records room, and the Sorven histories, and the specific shape of a lineage that had been waiting to be claimed. She thought about a direwolf walking through a hall of people who expected to be chosen and lying down at the feet of the one who had not expected anything. I know that feeling, she said. Veth moved out of the shadows of the wall and sat beside them, and the three of them were quiet together in the way that felt like the beginning of a very long and complex and necessary story. The kind of story that did not have a final chapter, because it was the kind that kept adding pages, kept finding new rooms in itself, kept revealing that what had seemed like an ending was only the place where something larger began. The forest breathed against the wall. The last of the moonlight moved through the elder trees. Sable felt the resonance of all of it around her and within her, and she did not suppress it, did not make it small, let it be the full size of what it was. She was Sorven blood, last of a line that had chosen silence and produced, in that silence, a daughter who would choose something different. She was a healer, which was the truest thing about her, and the thing that would remain true through everything that changed. She was the one a direwolf had chosen, which was not something she had expected, and was not something she was going to waste. And she was, for the first time, not afraid of any of those things being true simultaneously. The world was large enough to hold all of it. She was large enough to hold all of it. She had been waiting, without knowing it, to understand that.